Hello, everybody. We are live ahead of qualifying for the Las Vegas Grand Prix. Rob, you are on location in Sin City. What's it like out there?
It's such a hive of activity. Obviously, really excited for the next 60 minutes. But yeah, being in Vegas, inaugural race weekend, there's a lot of people that are gearing up for hopefully a pretty eventful race tomorrow. But we've just 2 hours until qualifying kicks off, and I feel like based on what we've seen through practice so far, there's been a few surprises, a few things that have probably gone as expected. So looking forward to cutting through all of kind of what's transpired in the last 24 hours or so, and yeah, figuring out where we're going to land on our teams.
How are the people that you've run into? Are they generally upset about what happened with FP1 and FP2, or are people just starting to move on and get fired up for qualifying?
I know two guys that drove in from San Diego, the Furious Motorsport guys. They, as far as I'm aware, drove 8 hours or so from San Diego just for practice and just for last night's session, obviously, and to have 9 minutes of track time, it's not great. So I don't know if that $200 gift card to merchandise is quite going to compensate for obviously the time outlay, but
Brutal.
hopefully we have an eventful race to look forward to, no matter where you're watching it from tomorrow.
All right. Well, as always, we'll get into some of the things that we'll talk about in the next hour. So, Rob and I will be fielding your questions both in the chat and in our FanAmp base. If you want us to review your entire lineup, feel free to post a screenshot in the base, and then our producer will move it into a slide deck that I'll share on the screen, and we can review it live here in the hour. While you're in the base, feel free to answer our contest question this week, which is how many DNFs do you think will happen in Vegas tomorrow night? The winner gets a $50 gift card to Fifth Gear Garms. I'm rocking them again tonight. And the chance to rename either my team or Rob's team for the final time this year. So be sure to enter soon. Then in about 20 minutes, we're going to have Terry from F1 Coffee Corner back with us. He's going to give us some technical insight based on what we've seen in the free practices, and then give us a little bit more of that background we need to make sure we make the right lineup decisions in the penultimate race of the season. Rob, let's head over to some of the FP3 data because it was a mixed bag for sure.
Yeah, it was quite a surprise to see Sainz and Leclerc that far down the order. I know it may not have been quite as extensive as last night's 90-minute session that ran into the early hours of this morning, but I think to a lot of people, surprising to see, George Russell, Oscar Piastri, and Logan Sargent in the top three for FP3. So I don't think I'm going to read into these practice times a great deal. I think there's some things that can be said for where the Red Bulls finished, say Alex Albon, Fernando Alonso, and I think Terry wanted to talk to the extent that Mercedes could be a factor in this race too later in the show. But there were, I know a couple of surprises, but I'm also confident that Ferrari is still going to be quite competitive around this circuit, despite the fact that they were languishing down in P16 and P17. What's your kind of viewpoint on the last practice session for this weekend?
It's interesting. A little while ago, I had a few people through the various socials reaching out to say, I just woke up. What happened in FP3? I think to make a long story short, Albon made contact with the wall and lost his rear tire. It went rolling down the track. It red flagged the session early. And so you had several teams that didn't get their last flying laps in on the soft tire. Ferrari being one of them. That's why you see Charles and Carlos all the way down at the bottom of the grid here. Meanwhile, those drivers that had just posted the flying laps coming back up to the top here are as high as they are. There was really high track evolution, and the commentary really talked about it throughout the whole hour of the session. The track evolution is really going to drive the pecking order both in this session and in qualifying in a few hours too. So there are some themes that I think are important. George Russell definitely looks like the stronger of the two Mercedes setups in a single lap pace. I think Piastri is emblematic of McLaren starting to turn it around, that they can still have a finish inside the top 10, so I wouldn't run from them yet. And as we expected, Williams is fast on a fast course. So those things are themes that I take away from FP3, but that doesn't necessarily mean we'll see Logan on the podium come tomorrow.
Yeah, no, fully agree. I think Williams will be more competitive than we've probably seen in recent times, and Albon is no doubt going to be leading the charge for them. Sargent, I'd love to see him contend for a point or two. Whether or not he's actually able to convert that straight line speed into something of a reasonable finish is yet to be believed. But I do have high hopes for Albon and the Williams. I have had one eye on him for a couple of weeks now, given how competitive they were at Monza, for instance, and I fully expect that to translate into this week as well. So really excited to see, I mean, not just the Williams, but how Ferrari go as well. I know you just pointed out that they didn't get that fast lap in at the end, but we saw in FP2 what they are truly capable of, and I definitely think they deserve a lot of consideration for this week, given that the template seems a little bit more open at the moment after Mercedes perhaps disappointed in Brazil. So I think for me, I'm weighing up whether the Sainz grid penalty is worth it over Leclerc. I think he still, for me, even though has probably had a slightly underwhelming season, I still think I prefer him in a vacuum to Sainz, but the grid penalty maybe sways things, and whether or not the constructor features in our teams this week as well.
Agreed. And John actually queued that up as one of the first questions: is which of the two Ferrari drivers would you pick if you had a choice and budget wasn't a factor? I think you hit the nail on the head as far as Leclerc has the higher upside as far as where he'll finish in the race. For Sainz, it really depends on where he ends up. Then you add the 10 places for the grid penalty. Will he find himself in a really troubling part of the pack where he could get some of that traffic that could trigger a DNF? That adds some risk. Leclerc will probably have some clean air behind Verstappen in the top three at the beginning of the race. So I think Sainz has the higher upside, but also has the higher DNF risk because he's going to be in the middle of the pack.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've exhibited concern about that. You have our Tom Popman, a friend of the channel, has also said the same thing in his final thoughts as well recently. So I think, you know, between the three of us and a number of other expert fantasy players, there's some concern to be in the proverbial meat grinder, but I still think if he can escape the first couple of laps without any kind of incidents, any drains getting in the way, then perhaps there's you know, a real good sign for Sainz to convert that into a push for points, top 5 driver of the day, all kind of factors that could make him, you know, a potentially top scoring asset this weekend.
You mentioned driver of the day. It'll be really interesting to see who gets it this week. It's Lando's on 3 in a row. McLaren are on 5 in a row as a team. So someone is due. Even if Max wins the race, I think everyone's over giving it to him at this point. So it'll be interesting to see if a Ferrari gets it, because I think a podium finish or a top 2, either Carlos or Charles will get it. And if Carlos moves way up the grid and finishes on or near the podium, I think he could get it hands down.
Yeah, definitely. I think the Ferraris are going to be competitive, single lap, race pace. They've got all the makings of a car that can push Max to the limit. I still think Max deserves to be the outright favorite for the race. The Red Bull is consistently looking excellent around this track. And Perez, another driver I'd like to talk a little bit about as well, despite his shortcomings recently, seems to have hopefully bounced back in Brazil, but we said that the week before Mexico, and he obviously put in that stinker too. So there's a few different options around that kind of 20.5 million price point. And, you know, maybe not, I mean, Russell kind of re-enters the discussion a little bit after P1 in FP3, but, you know, Sainz, Perez, Leclerc, a couple million more. There's so many different options kind of that as that second driver to Max.
Absolutely. And maybe we should actually kick over to F1 Fantasy Tools. I'm going to just refresh in case Ryder updated his post FP3 sims. He said he'll be doing it soon, so maybe I'll check back in a little bit. This is my team with the 139.6 million budget, and you can see the sim says to lean in to that Ferrari build, and then heavy, you know, double AlphaTauri, and to trust Perez. So I said never again, but
never say never,
maybe,
right?
I know it's the gambler's mentality. I'm sure you're seeing it wherever you go in Vegas.
Oh,
Maybe this is
man.
my lucky week.
Yeah, look, I mean, William and Mike have called me out in the chat. One water for every 3 cocktails. You feed me one more cocktail on this stream, and I'll probably end up knee-jerking some obscene driver into that 3rd slot after Max and Carlos. But I was really interested to see these guys have Lando in that top team. I definitely think McLaren will be featuring there and thereabouts for the points, but I'm just not so sure that they're going to be around the podium places, at least Lando anyway, that we've become accustomed to in recent times. And I think there are, you look at Max, you look at Sainz from the grid penalty, you look at Perez, who did look also very good in FP3, FP2. These guys could all be the highest point scorers for the weekend. So, someone like me who's looking at autopilot, I think that looks very good. And, Perez is probably going to be slightly lower owned for people within the top 10,000 or so. So that is a differential unto itself. So plenty of options. And as always, we seem to have in recent times made it quite a challenging decision to make at the deadline.
Especially as the top 10,000 teams, I think they're in a few different buckets. There's those that realize I'm not going to get as low as I need to get into the prizes or get into the top 1,000. So maybe they've parked a lot of these McLaren teams. So you have this late season zombie flavor. And then you have the teams that are still active and in it that are trying to get a piece of Ferrari. So I think I might go with that smaller group and have at least one Ferrari. You could see the constructor is in all of the recommended lineups here so far. I think I'm going to have to move heaven and earth to get that Ferrari constructor in.
Do you think you will want to go for Ferrari constructor, even if it does take a hit? I mean, I've looked at probably 3 or 4 different options. We were talking earlier today about this, about what it would take to get, sufficient Ferrari coverage in our team. I think Sainz for me, I mean, I've been talking about Leclerc a lot this week. That grid penalty doesn't look like it's going to eventuate this season at all, that I speculated. But for Sainz, I think maybe that edges him if you're confident he can escape the first couple of laps of chaos. The Ferrari constructor obviously requires a bit of an upheaval as a result of that. But I think even if it takes a -4, which I'm not overly pleased about with wildcard in our pocket, if Ferrari can get their act together and string together a performance like we saw in Monza or Singapore, then I think that's going to really make the difference between a good week and a great week.
With my chip situation, I have final fix and wildcard left. So with wildcard, I could do any of these 1 extra or 2 extra transfer moves, drop the wildcard, not take the penalties, and then use final fix next week. Or I could try to do something clever and start with a lineup that has Perez or Leclerc in it. They'll probably qualify higher than Sainz. Then you final fix them out for Sainz and try to hope for the overtake points. I'm not sure which way I'm leaning quite yet. I definitely know that some Ferrari coverage, both driver and probably constructor, are in my future. I'm not sure if I trust McLaren, which is in that second constructor spot now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm grappling with the same issue. I think it's more than likely going to be a -4 unless I keep the McLaren constructor, and I'm just not sure about that. I'm kind of on the fence, and maybe Terry can sway our decisions one way or another. But do we want to quickly look at some teams before we bring him in, if there are any that have been submitted? Because I know we want to try and get him in shortly. So if you want to lead the way on that, I'm happy to.
Sure. So with 5 minutes left until Terry, we've got a few in the FanAmp base. The first is from Luke. And for anybody who hasn't been following Luke, he's P9 in the Global League right now. I actually talked to P1 earlier. He's a follower of mine and Rob's, and he's on a plane and didn't watch FP3 and had to set his lineup before he left. Unfortunately, he didn't share it with me, so we'll have to see at the end of the weekend what he ran, but perhaps Luke could make a move on him while he's in the air. So Luke has 2 lineups here. One is triple Red Bull, double Ferrari, double AlphaTauri, which is very close to one of the lineups I was thinking about. Heavy exposure to Ferrari. You get Sainz twice, but then also a lot of danger here. AlphaTauri have been trending toward the bottom third of the grid in free practice and in the sims. Perez, like you said, is definitely heartburn inducing these last few races. He's got
Mm.
two 30-plus point performances, but he also has 3 DNFs.
Yeah, I mean it's hard. I think there's many of us that have been burnt by Perez more than once in this second half of the season. I think my decision will ultimately boil down to having 3 drivers in my team that are all in contention for the top scoring honors this weekend, and Perez is certainly one of those who can feature in the mix there. Sainz, obviously Luke's got both in his team, and Sainz is probably going to be in my like I'd say 90% certain in my team, and the Ferrari constructor as well. You're covering the overtakes and positions gained through Carlos Sainz, and you've got, as you've pointed out before, that kind of high upside that Leclerc can offer if he can make it through a formation lap. So I think there's a lot to like about both teams Luke has on the screen. I'm probably myself leaning. I want to say the left team, but I don't love the fact that Joe and Ricardo. I guess I'm trying to play to the strengths for me of the autopilot rather than the balance, which I think Luke likes on the right hand side with Alonso, Albon, and I was very optimistic about Albon. I still think he's going to have a solid race, P6 in FP3. So I really don't think you can go wrong. But I just feel like for an autopilot user like myself, I'm trying to get as much out of the chip as possible, and Perez and Sainz really do offer that. What's your view? I mean, I can't fault either team, to be honest.
I've been trying to run the numbers in my head. So he's basically down to Perez and Ricardo versus Alonso and Albon. I think if Checo can finish this race, it'll be on the podium, and that's just enough by himself to outscore the two of them. Then if Ricardo is out in Q1, he just gains a few points, and then all you need are 5 to 7 points from Ricardo, and that's enough to put them over the top. Unless you have a really stellar day from Alonso that puts him on the podium and he gets driver of the day. I think the most likely team to succeed is the one on the left. I would just think ahead, Luke. If you are heading into Abu Dhabi with the team on the left and 2 free transfers, what would you do? Is that lineup right? Can you maneuver out of it in a way that'll work? Can you live with Ferrari, or would you need to take a punt?
I think the one kind of point of view I have on Ferrari for the next 2 weeks is that it is only 2 weeks. It's not like you need to completely overhaul your team next week to prepare yourself for upcoming races. I think, if Ferrari can demonstrate they're going to be competitive this week, then I can't really see them falling off a cliff in Abu Dhabi. I don't expect them to be the best team next week either, but I still think they're going to be in the mix.
Good enough.
Yeah, good enough. Exactly. And I've got wildcard. Mike's obviously asked who's got that. We both have wildcard. So I think for me, even if I take a -4 and I have 4 kind of slots that I need to think about heading into Abu Dhabi, I've got that on the back burner if I need to.
That sounds good. Let's do one more before we head over and invite Terry in. This is Leaps Frog, and this is triple Ferrari, double budget driver. And I think, to me, this depends on what you're trying to accomplish in your league. Is it one of those things where you're in first place by a narrow margin and you're trying to do something to hold on? Or are you trying to make a splash with 2 races left to chase a mini league leader or move up in the global ranks? To me, this is a team that if you're trying to make the big splash, you go all in on Ferrari. And if you have a DNF, it hits you twice. Oh, well, nothing ventured, nothing lost. But if you're trying to sustain a lead and you're trying to play it conservative, this lineup does have a lot of risk to me.
Yeah, I fully agree. I'm actually looking at one. I could well end up on this same team with the exception of Perez instead of Leclerc because of budget constraints. But I mean, there's a lot to like. Joe's probably the one kind of glaring, I wouldn't call it a hole, but one driver I'm just not fully convinced on, but still the best of the rest under 7.5. So it's tough for me to say with any confidence. I'm not even sure if I end up going with this team, but I do think Ferrari and Sainz are probably where my head's at. So if I end up going Perez in that last slot, it could be great. But I think there's a lot of upside. Sorry, I'm rambling at this point because I'm thinking about my own team too. But there's a lot to like. Joe, I'm just really not sure, and I'd love to get Terry's thoughts on Alfa Romeo for this race because they had a pretty disappointing Brazil, and the simulations seem to suggest they could be more competitive. But whether that's one thing versus what he thinks could be another is something I'd love to pick his brains on. So, on the topic of that, should we bring Terry in, Adam?
Let's do it. So for anyone who missed last time, Terry runs an amazing social platform called F1 Coffee Corner. Every day he gives us all of the most important bits around the Formula One world. And Terry has this really deep technical background on all things Formula One. So we bring him in to share some of his insights on what we've seen so far this weekend and help some of these decisions that Rob and I are on the fence on. Terry, welcome back.
Thanks for having me back. I was going to say morning, but obviously we're all in different time zones. Probably everybody in the chat is as well. So, I think I'll skip that part.
We're a bit all over the place.
Yeah.
Well, let's get right into the questions. We have a lot for you today. And I want to start with our giveaway question about DNFs, because our viewers have been predicting a lot of mayhem this weekend, but I'm not seeing a lot of drivers losing control through the free practices, and only Albon made contact with the wall to end FP3. Are you seeing a lot of potential for DNFs? Are you seeing drivers, some of those runoffs potentially spilling into the race, or are we just blowing this out of proportion?
Beginning of the week, I was sharing everyone's concerns about DNFs, and we heard about temperatures, tyre temperatures, all of the kind of horror stories. But I think a lot of that has been dispelled, like you say, because the temperature is a lot higher than what we originally led to believe. So we're looking at about 13 degrees for the race itself. So I don't think we're going to have a problem with engines and temperatures and tyre temperature, because that's not actually anywhere near as bad as we first thought. In terms of DNFs, there's going to be looking at engines. Some of them are coming to the end of their life, but actually I think the teams are managing that, and the reliability is really good, as we talked about on the last show with the engine freeze being in place. And the reliability issues that we saw years ago are not really in play today. So I'm not expecting that. My main concern is that first corner is giving me Singapore vibes, if I'm honest, from the start. And I think it's going to hinge around that side of the race. If you can stay out of trouble on the opening lap into the first corner, I think it will settle down. The runoff area is a bit better than I thought. So some of the lockouts we've seen, we saw Max obviously going off because I think it was Danny Ricciardo had gone off as well. So there seems to be a bit more runoffs than what we were first led to believe, to give drivers the get out, I would say. So I'm not sure we're going to see a high level of it as we originally thought.
So you mentioned obviously that kind of first turn or first couple turns in the race. And if we look at a driver like Carlos Sainz, who's probably going to start somewhere between P11 and P15, he's obviously on the radar for a lot of us this weekend. I think he'll be very tempting because he's starting a bit further back with those overtakes and positions gained that we know and love in fantasy. But do you think that starting from kind of that part of the midfield where he's in the mix with a lot of midfield teams jostling for position in the opening laps, has he got enough in the tank to take him to a podium place? Do you think he in the car is going to be competitive enough on a circuit that seems to work in favor of the Ferrari from what we've seen so far?
Absolutely. I mean, he's going to have a brand new engine. We've got 2 races. That Ferrari is going to be cranked all the way up. It's going to be exciting to see. I think he's going to have to play the waiting game with the first couple of laps. And I think he's going to have to almost sit back and let whatever's in front of him unfold. I think that's going to be key to his race. But if you look, the slipstream on the main straight is giving an extra 6 kilometers an hour, which is absolutely massive. We look at the speed trap data. So that, coupled with Carlos and a brand new engine, is actually going to help him come through the pack immensely easy, I think, in terms of some of the cars that are going to be ahead of him after he's taken that penalty, obviously.
Terry, you said something off air before we came on that I want to bring back up, and that's about Ferrari not getting those runs on soft tires in FP3. Could that be an advantage that they have slightly newer soft tires going into qualifying?
Yeah, it's a double effect. They obviously haven't got the data from running the soft tyre, but actually there are some pretty good data from what they did on the medium and the runs they did on that. And they've obviously banked an extra set of tyres almost inadvertently by not doing that soft run. So they've actually got a fresh set of soft tyres to either use in qualifying for a flying lap if something happens, or even bank for the race itself by not doing that final run. So in a way, it might have actually played in their favour. I think you said earlier about the times after, I fully expected Ferrari putting a flying lap. They would have been pretty much near the top of the charts, if not at the top from what we've seen so far. Yeah, they look really strong this weekend.
So for those of you considering signs, it looks like it's all good news, but just keep an eye out on lap 1, turn 1. We don't want to have an Albon versus Magnussen from Brazil again.
Yeah.
So another driver that I think interests me this weekend after the performance we saw from him in Brazil is Fernando Alonso. Now, he's entered the discussion based on that recent performance. It looks like the car resembles something that we saw in the first half of the season. And he's had a couple of really good practice sessions so far to suggest he could be in the mix for a podium, as Adam alluded to earlier in the show. Do you think, or what's your take on Aston Martin? Is a podium realistic for them? Do you think they've got enough in the bank to qualify kind of in a pretty competitive position? Or is it something that they might end up falling back in the race and losing a couple of positions?
I think Fernando looks competitive. I'm not sure he looks competitive enough for a podium. And I think the Red Bulls and the Ferraris are going to be your main podium chasers. And then I think Mercedes might come into play a bit as well with one of their 2 drivers. But Fernando's a wily old fox and he plays a really good race. So I wouldn't bet against him. The cars does look competitive. They have made some slight tweaks to it. They were one of only 3 teams to bring an upgrade, which is a front sort of nose upgrade to cut down on some of the drag. So actually, from their point of view, they have made some changes. Fernando looks comfortable with it. His runs look like he was happy with it. He's given that vibe that he's not got any major sort of issues. So I think that Fernando would be good. I think that Lance might struggle towards the back end of the points again in the sort of 12th, 13th. So if I was going to look at it, I would say that Aston will be good with Fernando, but maybe not as good with Lance. I don't think that the car's good enough for Lance to come through in a way, but I think it's good enough for Fernando to compete and be there if anything goes wrong in terms of the race itself, to be able to pick some pieces up, or of course strategy, which is the other unknown with this one with no historic data to go off.
Question comes at a good time because we've had a few people ask us about Limitless, and it's obvious that Red Bull and Ferrari assets will be really popular, but that last driver, do you go with maybe Lando Norris or a Mercedes or Fernando Alonso? It sounds like Alonso could be in the mix, but perhaps you've seen more, Terry, out of George Russell and Lando than you've seen out of Fernando so far.
Yeah, I mean, the Mercedes really interested me in FP3 because I think they were clearly running 2 different sort of setups. George clearly looks a lot more comfortable. Well or not, that means Mercedes are going for a race pace with Lewis and George is over the 1 lap one. But ultimately, I think that the Mercedes is going to have more than Aston Martin in terms of the pace from what I'm seeing so far. And I think there's still probably a bit more to come from Mercedes. Lando, he's not giving me anything which actually makes me want to take a punt on him so far. McLaren have brought some upgrades around the rear wing, around the main beam wing, and Oscar's time was good, but with 4 minutes of the session left, you'd expect that to fall back quite a bit. Oscar obviously taking advantage of everyone's on a new track for the first time. You know, Oscar's got 11 playing field and no one's driven on it, which is probably something he's enjoying. And this weekend, I kind of would go Oscar over Lando. I think Lando he hasn't got or seen anything to make me want to take that punt over a George or a Fernando.
I got a lot out of that answer because it's one part for limitless teams. That sounds like Russell would be the best 5th driver out of that scenario. And then also for those of us that have loaded up with triple McLaren, there's more and more evidence that we should start backing away from it, particularly the constructor, because there's a lot of risk in what they've shown us so far. And also the finding of Oscar really high up in FP3 could just be a result of track evolution and then Ferrari not really getting their due on track.
Yeah, no, definitely.
There was one question in the chat from Jordan around Albon, obviously that incident in FP3, whether or not he'll be ready. I would assume so, unless either of you guys have seen or heard anything since this show's kicked off that would suggest otherwise. But I guess we've talked a lot about the teams that are going to contend for the podium places, you know, the big 5, Red Bull, Mercedes, Aston Martin, Ferrari, McLaren. Albon, for me, is probably the one driver among the rest of the teams that stands out as someone that could push for a P7, P8, even maybe a P6 if he gets the right race. Do you think, Terry, that he's in the mix for a good race. I think the straight line speed's been well spoken about, but what's your take on Williams and whether or not Albon can kind of replicate something that we saw in Monza?
I'm not hearing there's any problems with getting the car ready, to be honest. I don't think it was major damage to the back of his car, what he called it. It was more, I think, dramatic with the tyre coming off. So I don't think there's going to be a problem getting it ready. I think Alex is good for some points. I would probably place Alex over the Alfa Tauris at the moment. Obviously, providing the car's fine and he qualifies okay. I certainly think that Williams have got enough with the straight line speed to be competitive around here, around the lower points. And I don't think the tyre deg is going to be any much an issue, which is normally their problem around falling off. And they tend to be quite good with strategy as well, when we think back to long stints and keeping Alex kind of in that points position. So certainly low end of the points, I would fancy Alex Albon over someone like a Yuki or Danny Ricciardo, personally, at the moment.
That's actually a good segue to another question we had as we talk about AlphaTauri. A lot of our lineups have been featuring either Daniel because of his price or Yuki because of his recent run of form. But in the simulations, AlphaTauri are last in the qualifying sim, and I think they're 6th or 7th in the race simulation. What do you know about AlphaTauri this week? Will their upgrade package and taking on some of that rear suspension from the RB19 translate to a decent weekend in Las Vegas, or is this a track where they could take a step back?
I think they're going to take a step back. I think they're getting Red Bull Singapore vibes for me in terms of setup. They got this new suspension. I don't think they fully understand it because obviously it's been late edition. Their floor to compensate with that isn't ready until next week. And I think just the way that the ride height's running, the way that the setup is, I've not seen anything which makes me think they're going to get it right before qualifying in the race. So I would say that they're going to really struggle this weekend looking at what I've seen. And I think that's why I think they've got these new parts, which have worked great over some of the previous tracks. I think they're now in that mindset of when we're honing into the sort of detail of getting that setup right, they're struggling a bit to understand it. And they haven't got the pace or the setup to kind of challenge.
Now I'm nervous. I was leaning toward that double AlphaTauri lineup, and I'm trying to think in my head, will they qualify low and just survive ahead of some other drivers that might DNF or slide back in the pack, and that be enough? Mm-hmm. Or should I start looking at the Zhou Hulkenberg contingency in that lower part of the grid?
Yeah, I mean, you make a great point, both of you, because the current lineup, the other side of my screen now has a Zhou in there because I want a bit of Ferrari and a bit of Red Bull. And obviously we have that concern around the Ferrari power unit reliability that we saw in Brazil that afflicted a couple of the drivers, both Alfa Romeos as well. I think my approach, Adam, is just hoping that Zhou, even if he doesn't have a great qualifying or a great race, can get to the end of the race without any incidents. Because it seems to me, Terry, that Alfa Romeo don't seem to be all that competitive. I feel like the race simulation pace, you might have to jog my memory here, Adam, but looked more competitive than perhaps I might have anticipated.
Yeah, I'm seeing on the race simulation pace I'm looking at now, Alfa Romeo are constructor P5 ahead of McLaren, AlphaTauri, and Alpine.
I don't pace them above McLaren still. I think McLaren with their setup, I'm not sure they run their engine at full power for FP2 and obviously getting used to the track. I would still place McLaren above them, to be honest, if I had to put a stake on what I'm seeing so far. I think they're going to be competitive. That Ferrari engine's clearly strong. The straight line speed looks good, but I think it'd be one sort of 2 lap, and I think we might get a good qualifying and then a fall off, which we've seen from Alfa Romeo quite a bit over this season, where we get that good performance where we think brilliant, and then come race itself, they just kind of disappear and the commentators forget they're there.
That makes sense. And the pace simulations that we've seen are based off of a 7-minute FP1 and a weird FP2. McLaren definitely showed us the most they showed us all weekend in FP3, which was after the sims were published. So that all makes sense.
Are there any
Rob, you and I will be biting our nails for the next 20 minutes of which budget drivers will we sneak in. It might be just an eeny, meeny, miny, mo come the top of the hour.
You're not wrong. I think, though, I'm in maybe a slightly different boat to a number of other people watching, that I want to, and I'm like 99% certain I'm using autopilot this weekend, and I do want to have 3 drivers that are all going to be in the mix for a podium. So right now, as I pointed out before, my other screen, or the other half of my screen, shows Max, Sergio, and Carlos as my top 3 kind of premium options, and then Daniel, Ricciardo, and Joe, which are kind of more just hope they don't qualify that high and make up a couple of overtakes over the course of the race, with Red Bull and Ferrari as my constructors. So I think I'm just going to play the field in a sense that one of the 3 premium picks I've got could ultimately score highest this weekend, and probably not focus as much on the balance that, you know, some other options like Alonso or Norris could provide. But I don't think there's really any bad options from the names we've reeled off recently. So slightly different strategy, but I don't think unless Terry, there are any particular surprises. I guess that is, if you've got any kind of closing remarks around things we need to keep in mind, any drivers or constructors that, you know, could really surprise us or could underwhelm. It's a track we've obviously not raced at before, so lots of variables in play.
Alpine, I think, look really underwhelming at the moment, and Pierre Gasly alluded to the fact they're trialing a lot of new parts for next year. Seems a really strange track to bring upgrades to trial for next year, but there you go. They've obviously, you know, found a way to get it in there. So I don't think Alpine are going to be anywhere near sort of competitive from what I'm seeing. Strategy is going to be key here. We think that the hard compound's not even going to get a look in for the race itself, looking at what we saw today in free practice 3. So it's going to be very much a soft medium strategy, whether or not it's going to be a 1 or 2 stop. The soft tyres yesterday were falling off quite rapidly, but then today actually there was drivers pushing when they're 4 or 5 laps old on flying laps. So it looks like today, with the balance, with the control the teams have got, actually the tyre deg isn't as bad as what we originally led to believe on the first sort of FP2, I should say, rather than FP1. So yeah, so strategy is going to be key. Pit lane itself doesn't look like it's going to cause problems and stuff. So I would say that the safe bet has got to be the top teams at the moment. You know, it's got to be that from the point of view of that first corner, opening up is going to be the big problem. Apart from that, I'm not sure it's going to be as sort of for DNS and crashes and things as we originally thought.
Fingers crossed for that, because I'm on 5 weeks in a row with the DNF, and my heart can't take anymore. Meanwhile, the chat, it looks like our current poll update is 60% of our respondents said 3 to 4 DNFs, and 40% said 5 or more DNFs. So 5 or more DNFs would put it probably third or so, most DNFs on the year. So the chat is expecting some chaos. Great. Terry, any final thoughts, takeaways from free practice before we get back to some of our lineup reviews?
No, not at all. I think it's going to be exciting. It's good we've got over the issues. We've got cars on track. They look quite settled. They look like they're in a routine in terms of running and getting into the setups. Like I say, I think Mercedes have got a lot more to give. I think Ferrari are going to be really competitive. I think that Red Bull are going to be the team to beat. They're compromising a lot in terms of their straight line speed, but they can, because they've got that to give. And yeah, a Red Bull with that triple DRS, with that slipstream, is going to absolutely fly down there. So if someone like Checo is further behind, expecting to be overtaken quite dramatically and quite fast.
A lot of records in Red Bull's court this week. So Max could tie Sebastian Vettel with 53 wins. That'd be the 3rd most all time. If Checo or Max win, it would be the 20th win for Red Bull, which is the first constructor to ever have 20 wins in a season. And Max, regardless of the outcome, will have his 38th consecutive race leading the Drivers' Championship, and that breaks a Michael Schumacher record. So a lot on the table for Red Bull this week.
Phenomenal. And I still can't see past Red Bull being the team to beat at the moment. I think they've got enough in there. I think Ferrari may have that single lap pace, but I think race pace is definitely going to come back to Red Bull.
Cool.
That makes sense.
Terry, thanks for your time as always.
Thank you for having me on.
Provided us with so many insights, and as was the case in Brazil, I think I've had my opinion swayed slightly. So appreciate the input as always, and I'm sure Adam's grappling with a few last minute decisions based on what we've just talked about.
Yeah, hopefully I haven't caused too many problems.
Never.
No, this is wonderful. Thank you so much, Terry. And be sure to check out Terry. He's on TikTok, X, Instagram. He has his own podcast too. Terry does it all. So be sure to check him out at F1 Coffee Corner.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, Terry.
All right. Let's fire up the screen share again and get back to some of those lineups that came in over the last few minutes. This is from our friend Mike. He's grappling with a lineup. This is one of those evenly dispersed teams, like you'd mentioned earlier, Rob. He's got a piece of Science, but he's also got Fernando and Alex too. This looks like a perfectly safe lineup to me. If you were, say, ahead in your league and you wanted one of those nice, safe lineups, it's not over-indexed on Ferrari, but you also have a lot of high upside drivers too.
Yeah, definitely. If Alonso can obviously make that car look as competitive as we saw in Brazil, then I think that really makes him a very viable option to own. Interestingly, I don't know where Sainz shook out in the points projections on F1 Fantasy Tools, but a couple of the guys have called out that that's just recently been updated, and Sainz is projected to score 31.4 points this weekend, according to our friends over there. So I think obviously great that Mike's got him in the team. Albon and Ricardo, also great options. They got the wild card. I think wild card for me, a couple of people have also asked about that. I am most likely going to take a -4, but I would also think I'd be taking a -4 next week if I move out some of the Ferrari coverage in favor of, say, McLaren or Mercedes. So what's your take now that Mike's just called out the wild card? If you had to use it this week or next, I know it's very team dependent, but what do you think dictates the use this week versus next week?
I think that there's a few factors to me. One is in your case, Rob, you have 2 chips. So it's the wild card now or the autopilot now, and then the other ones next week. For those of you that have just the wild card, I would say really whichever team is going to trigger the biggest penalty. And I'd even be okay with a -4 this week just because we're on to 2 races left of the season, and try to think just one step ahead. If you have a team, and then how many, like for this lineup that Mike has here, how many transfers is it going to take for him to get out of that lineup on the other side if he wanted to make some moves? He has a lot of wiggle room because I can see a lot of these pieces playing well in Abu Dhabi. So maybe I think he'd be fine with the wild card now. In your shoes, I think the autopilot could be the better chip this week. You take the -4 to bring in Sainz, but if he has that great week, he has that driver of the day win.
It's worth
He
it.
could overtake Max, and then it has its purpose. Remember, Lando's beaten Max in 3 out of the last 6 races in the fantasy game, so it's not like Max is Thanos here. He can be topped by someone.
Not to mention as well that Singapore and Monza, where Sainz was the equal or highest point scorer that weekend, he scored driver of the day. He outscored Max Verstappen. And Singapore and Monza are the 2 tracks that seem to be drawing the most comparison to Las Vegas because of the straights that we see, or the top speeds we see at Monza, and then obviously those street circuit characteristics that we see in Singapore. So I think you add all of those factors together, you throw in a Sainz that's starting probably, in the bottom, or definitely in the bottom half of the grid, overtakes positions gained driver of the day. I think Ferrari is back on the menu, and for good reason.
Yeah, Sainz with a new power unit, the newest one on the grid. He probably won't go too hard in Q3 just to avoid any major incidents. Maybe just give Leclerc a little tow, find himself between 8th and 10th and start in the grid 18th to 20th. So I think this lineup looks great. And then Mike says in the chat, this would have been a -8. That is firmly in the wheelhouse for throwing the wild card out there.
Yeah. Definitely. So do you think now that we've got 15 minutes until the deadline, an hour and 15 minutes. I'm so used to us being right before the deadline. And
we could go, we can go past the top of the hour if we want to.
No, we can.
We just get sleepier and sleeper. Maybe
no, you've got a bedtime. It's 1:44 a.m. for you, so we don't want to keep you up any later than you need to. But that means I don't actually need to scramble to lock in my lineup on stream. But yeah, is there? You want to maybe, I think, for Mike, as you said, Adam, -8, absolutely bring in wildcard if there's no other chips. But I think if you're deliberating between autopilot and wildcard, I think I prefer autopilot for this weekend. I think Abu Dhabi is probably a little bit more, maybe not locked in, but more certain for me because we've raced there before.
All right. I want to run through these last 2 lineups that were submitted. This is one of the first ones that we got for the week from Ziggy Jam. This one, I think this was pre-FP3 as well. He's going all in on Leclerc here. I'm thinking, as much as I love Lewis, I would get him out of there and get Max back in. And I think if you divest Norris and Hamilton, you could get Max and still a perfectly good number 3 driver there. You'd have Max, a piece of Charles. You could even, with enough moves, get Max, Charles, and Carlos in there. So I would just avoid Lewis this week because it looks like Mercedes isn't quite back yet.
Yeah, I agree. I think they'll be competitive, but are they competitive enough? Are they value enough where, say, Leclerc or even Perez, Sainz, now that he's got Leclerc, I just think there's a lot to like about this team. I like Leclerc, I like Alonso, I like Red Bull Constructor. You can make a case for Lando Norris, but I think if you're trying to move Hamilton into Verstappen, then Lando's probably the best make way in that case.
Agreed. We've got a little under 5 minutes until we hit the contest. So if you're in the chat and you haven't entered the contest yet, head on over to FanAmp, visit the Fantasy Formula base, and tell us how many DNFs you think we're going to see in the Grand Prix tomorrow. The last lineup is from Joe, and Joe has Joe. This looks like a perfectly good lineup to me with the double budget driver for the sake of triple Red Bull, Sainz, Ferrari. I think he's in a similar position as you and I, Rob, on how do we handle those bottom 2 positions? Do we? I don't think he can quite afford double AlphaTauri, but if you could afford them, or Joe or Hulkenberg, but the pickings are slim down there.
Yeah, I mean, I think Joe. I can't fault that team because that's the team I'm probably set on right now, to be honest. There'd need to be some kind of announcement in the next hour or so on any of the drivers on the screen currently for me to pivot away from any of them. But I like this team a lot. As long as Joe and Daniel Ricciardo don't qualify too high, then you can rely on the DNFs further up the field for them to make some points, and then you've got very adequate Ferrari and Red Bull coverage. I think I'm pretty much toing and froing between Perez every other week at the moment, but if he can just string together a qualifying that puts him on the top 2 rows, he's as good as gold for a podium, in my opinion, in that car.
Agreed. He's looked good in all the practice sessions. I think he has a little bit of his mojo back, just the confidence in some of his interviews. The team radio sound more confident. He's not seeing any issues with the car right now, whereas in previous weeks, the complaints started really early in the weekend for him, and they never got better. So,
yeah,
putting our faith in Perez.
I'll cross my fingers for maybe the 5th time in 7 weeks or something like that for Perez, but who knows?
All right. I'm hearing from our producer it's time to close the contest, so I will grab our entrants and throw them into the wheel. All right. We're going to spin away. And it looks like Harrison is the winner.
Congratulations.
That's wonderful. Pick a good name for Robert I, because it will be the last one that we have for the year. That's great. And then if we want to move over to my team and you can watch me stress for a little bit, this is where I'm at right now.
Same as me, but Joe instead of Tsunoda.
The wild card is here. I know I'm going with Verstappen, Perez, Sainz, Red Bull, and Ferrari. I can play around with this till the cows come home.
What are your other options if you weren't to go? I mean, Ricciardo's the most affordable there, but like, what other flexibility? Is it like a Hulk Joe? Yeah, I was about to say that's probably.
Yeah, it's going to be Hulk Joe. Yeesh.
You sound convinced with that, don't you?
Yeesh. God. Sergeant Tsunoda.
Sergeant.
No, I'm getting a little nauseous reading that lineup.
No. Maybe I'm just a bit loopy at, 10:49 p.m. in Vegas.
And then Joe Ricciardo, which is what everybody else is doing.
Yeah, it's all budget. I think I prefer the double AlphaTauris, to be honest. But we talked about this in our race preview, didn't we? That Alfa Romeo just seemed to have not fallen off a cliff, but they're just not really there. They're not. Joe's just, the pace maybe just isn't there to make those overtakes that we saw in the first half of the season. And if you have, I think, the budget, which you do, to get to Tsunoda, I think objectively he just seems like a better and more secure option in a car that seems over an entire race much more competitive. And, you can talk to the form he's in at the moment. It looks sensational.
I'm about to jinx him with this, but if you look at his last few races here, he's as steady as they come. He's been avoiding some of these problems, even in Qatar, where he had a bit of a lapse. He still had a decent race for a driver at the bottom of our teams. As long as if he starts at the bottom and stays at the bottom, as long as he finishes the race, they end up around 5 points each, and then the high end of the team performs. That should be enough to move up in the rankings. So,
yeah.
I think I'm going to lock in this lineup right here.
Oh, well, it's reassuring that we're both similarly aligned, budget constraints dependent. And having observed the last couple of weeks, I think the budget for the most part has been the difference between our rank swings, because it's, you've been able to stretch to that slightly more premium asset where I've maybe not been able to.
I want to just refresh and see, you had mentioned a moment ago that the rider simulation refresh. I just want to make sure he doesn't say anything nuclear for this team. So I'm going to select my team. And then for free transfers, 7+ is basically your way of saying I'm using the wild card. Team looks the same.
Yeah.
And you can see that the second option is Ricardo Joe.
Yeah, exactly.
It's basically 6 of one, half dozen of the other.
Yeah, exactly. 2 points in it. So that's the difference between, a couple of places in qualifying, to be completely honest, for any of the 5 drivers. So I'm pretty comfortable with where I'm at. I mean, I feel like we've talked about 3, 4, 5 different options, different lineups this week, but feeling pretty good so far with the certainly at least the 2 constructors and the 3 premium drivers in our team.
Rob, check out this YOLO team here, number 4. You put Sainz in the 2X, triple Ferrari with Perez Alonso.
That is spicier than the spicy tuna roll I had at dinner. So I don't hate it, but I think Max is still probably the safe bet. I don't need to worry too much about my 2 times as I've got autopilot this week. But yeah, wow.
I would need several of the Bellagio shoeies to lock this one in.
Well, that's what, $135 a shoe. It's an expensive team, mate. But yeah,
with my luck, I get all left feet or something.
Yeah, true. Well, I feel like the game's at a great stage. Now we've got so many different options to choose from, and I think a lot of people are entering this week in the last couple of weeks with certainly different builds up their sleeves. So really looking forward to seeing how things shake out heading into qualifying. It's so strange going into the end of the stream and there's still an hour to go, because I'm always usually scrambling. But do we want to quickly cover off any last questions in the chat? There seems to be a couple things that have been dropped in.
Absolutely. You can see, so William says, why not run Sainz over Verstappen if you're using autopilot? Yeah, it's all basically the same then. So if you have autopilot and you put the 2X on Sainz, and he's not the highest scoring driver, just moves over to Max. So that's A-okay. Yeah. I think for those of us that don't have it, I think I'm trusting Max to finish top 2. And then Sainz, you run the risk of him getting caught in some of that midfield traffic. And if one of them were to DNF, I'd say it would be Sainz. Although I hope it's a long shot.
Yeah, I mean, I still have reservations, but I think we're playing the upside game with those overtakes and that driver of the day nom too. So I hope we can get through this race unscathed, but I do also envy those with the no negative up their sleeve, because I think it's certainly the most powerful chip this weekend.
Felipe asked in the chat, why no McLaren drivers? And frankly, I think McLaren just haven't brought the right setup for this circuit. Starting all the way with the race and quali pace, they're behind the likes of Aston Martin and Mercedes. In all the free practice sessions, they had been toiling pretty low. And maybe you could make the case for Piastri, but in my case, where I was trying to maximize the Ferraris that I put on my team, Piastri was just the odd man out in terms of budget. I would have put Piastri in where you saw Tsunoda if I could afford it, but I didn't want to sacrifice the podium upside of Perez and Sainz for it. So it's a top-heavy team. Typically, I go for a more evenly balanced team, and in that scenario, you'd have Piastri there.
I mean, Mike just called out that Zach Brown's a little kind of pessimistic on McLaren's chances. They have, to be fair, said that a lot in the last few races. So whether or not, that's something to go off, probably take what Zach's saying with a grain of salt. But I also think, if we just quickly pivot back to F1 Fantasy Tools, or at least I'm looking at on my screen, Lando's projected to score 16.2 points this week at 20 million. You look at Russell, you look at Perez, you look at Sainz, all within a similar price bracket. They're all expected to score more points than Lando. And I do wonder, just from what we've seen so far in practice, only 2 obviously, but Lando hasn't really demonstrated to us that he's going to feature in the top spots. I mean, McLaren race pace is competitive, no doubt, but I just think Ferrari and Red Bull, Perez and Sainz, for instance, are offering probably more value than that.
Well said. And so Felipe follows up with, is it worth a -4 to get Piastri subbed out?
Depends,
I think it's yeah. If you're trying to get Ferraris in your lineup and Piastri is the sacrificial lamb, then I wouldn't have a problem with taking -4 in the context of 250, 300 points you'll score this week. But if you're looking at other drivers in his salary range, I don't. Him and Albon are probably even in my mind. Alonso, if you could afford him, might be an improvement and worth the -4. But otherwise, from a salary perspective, he's in no man's land as far as alternatives for him.
Yeah.
Back in the chat, Alejandro asks about a lineup that's Ferrari, Red Bull, Verstappen, Perez, Sainz, just like us, Sargent, and Ricciardo. This is where I might go off script from my lineup a little bit, because if anyone's going to DNF at this track, it's our man Logan.
Logan Sargent, yeah.
And so then maybe from there, I would peel off of Perez. How far down could you go?
Do you look at someone like Fernando Alonso and see if you can move Sargent up to like an Albon or a Tsunoda?
That's exactly what I was thinking, because it's 4.8 million you gain by switching to Alonso. And then 4.8, what's that, 10.6? That would put you at
that's Joe. That's a Joe, right? I don't think you can get to a Albon at 10.6.
No, you best you could do is a Joe or Tsunoda.
Yeah.
But
I'd probably prefer that, to be honest, over the Sargent risk. Unless, of course, maybe you if you have no negative Alejandro, then I think I like that lineup. But if you don't have it up your sleeve, then I would steer clear of Logan Sargent as much as possible.
Yeah, well said. And Rafa Las asks in the chat, any concerns with Sainz being in the middle of the grid with a potential of a big crash at the start like Brazil? Definitely. And we heard from Terry earlier, that run down to turn 1, lap 1, it gives some vibes of the Albon Magnussen collision in Brazil. So it will definitely be a white knuckle moment for me with Sainz, because he DNFs. I feel it twice because I have the constructor too. But I think given my global rank, I've got to give it a shot.
I'm the same. Brian goes, is a -4 with autopilot better than wildcard for the last race? I'm actually doing that, Brian. I'm taking a -4 this week to use autopilot, primarily because I want 3 potential race winning drivers in my team. And then I have the wildcard up my sleeve for next week, because there's every possibility Ferrari may not be as competitive as they are this week with less straight line speed on offer. So I fully expect I'll be taking a -4 next week as well. So does it matter if I take it this week or next week? Probably not. I'll use it anyway.
I co-sign that too. I think -4 with autopilot's the better play for this week.
Yep. Cool.
Rob, we are reaching the end of the hour. Any final thoughts as we locked in our teams? We've got an hour to wait until qualifying.
No, not really. I think we've seen as much as we can through 3 practice sessions, or 2 practice sessions and 10 minutes. But I think Ferrari are going to be very competitive, as we've talked about. Red Bull definitely too. I wouldn't be surprised if Alonso continues his good run of form and is in the mix for kind of a top 4. But even though I won't have Alex Albon in my team, I've loved the look of him in these straight line, these top speed circuits all season long. He's my sneaky good pick for a potential top 5 for the weekend. What's your kind of final closing remarks?
I think this could be a really big weekend for Ferrari. The kind of thing that if you picture the episode of Drive to Survive where they talk about the ups and downs of Ferrari for this season, this is going to be the race they showcase with at least one on the podium, maybe two, and turning the corners. They look ahead to 2024. So I think a big race for them.
Cool.
Oh, we missed a couple questions in the chat. Let's knock some quick ones out.
Quickly do it. Yeah.
Rory asks, Alonso and Albon versus Perez and Ricardo. Give me Perez and Ricardo because I think Perez's upside can outscore them both by himself. Ricardo then is just gravy. Hope he gets a handful of points or so.
Yeah. Yeah.
Samuel asks, favorite lineup for a healthy lead?
I think let's start with what we definitely know. Max, Red Bull. For a healthy lead, you probably got to throw at least one Ferrari asset in there. I'm thinking Sainz. Do you throw the Ferrari constructor in there? It really depends on like who behind you has what assets. If they've got McLaren constructor or Lando Norris, then do you just
cover them
off? Yeah, that's probably my thought.
That's where my mind went first, is get Sainz in because he's in for a big week, and then cover them off with Sainz and whatever other McLarens you have on your team. And then budget driver, probably best available AlphaTauri.
Yep. And then Lewis has pretty much asked, what about Verstappen, Perez, Sainz, Ricciardo, Hülkenberg, Red Bull, Ferrari? That's essentially the same lineup as Adam and I, except in place of Tsunoda that Adam has and Joe that I have, you've got Hulk. I think Hulk's a sound option. I don't think he's going to be better than Tsunoda or Joe this race, but I think the tire degradation concerns that Haas have had this season may be a little lower. I'm not expecting the temperatures outside to be 5 degrees as I think was initially expected, but it's still not going to be a warm race. So with the tires taking a little longer to warm up and wear down, I think Haas could be, they won't be blowing our minds away with a points finish, but I don't think they'll be regressing to P20 all of a sudden. So I think Hulk's a sound option there.
I'm fine with Hulk there too. He looks really fast, and the typical Hulk concern is that he's going to be fast in qualifying and then drop down in the race. But at this point in the year, with those few budget options, you can't quite reach Tsunoda. You don't want to pivot over to a Sargent. I think Hulk is a perfectly good low budget guy.
All right, let's answer these last two. We'll cut questions off after Grav. But Seth, would you do a -8 and prioritize Overpilot over the wild card? I also have Final Fix.
Here's what I'd do, Seth, because I was jostling with something similar earlier on. Either, I think if you wanted to use the Final Fix, you would do one change, have enough budget to do the second change after qualifying with the Final Fix, and that's how you would save yourself the 4 points, and potentially you'd have the benefit of looking at qualifying and then using it in a better spot. But which of those 3 chips would we use? So saving 8 points with the wild card, save 4 points and have the benefits of seeing qualifying with the Final Fix, or autopilot to buffer if Max isn't P1 in fantasy.
I think if you've got autopilot left, this is probably more open than Abu Dhabi will be. And I do think of the 3, I'm not so sure Final Fix for me is as valuable. I'd probably personally use the autopilot, but on a -8, if you get the autopilot pick right, the -8 essentially just writes itself off. So I would probably lean autopilot, but it's not easy.
Yes,
I think as well. Sorry, one more thing. I say there's probably a few overtakes for the Ferraris and the Red Bulls as well to take up on offer. So I don't know if Final Fix is going to be that valuable unless you're using it as you proposed, Final Fix in Signs. It's a tough one.
This is very close. I would probably edge wildcard. The -8 is in hand, whereas autopilot most races is wasted on someone other than Max not taking down. So -8's happening for sure. If you use the wildcard, you save yourself that. Autopilot, it's less certain. So I think it depends. If you're chasing and you really need to throw the Hail Mary out there, You could do autopilot or wait for final fix and just give it a best chance. Take the -8 in those cases. Or if you're safe in your league, you don't want to lose a lot of places, use the wild card to prevent the -8 and just hold on for dear life.
Yep. Fair assessment. Hulk and Ricardo, I think for me, Ricardo, and then Yuki and Albon, I think Albon because of the Williams straight line speed. Any contrary opinions on those?
Agree and agree. I think Ricardo's going to qualify low and move up. I think Hulk's going to qualify high and move down.
Cool. Brilliant. All right. Well, I think that will do it for tonight, Adam. Happy for you to do the honors and close us out as you always do.
Sounds good. Thank you all very much for joining us. You could be anywhere in the world and even asleep, but you chose to be here, and we really appreciate it. Enjoy the race and good luck this week. Rob and I will be back with an all-new episode of the Fantasy Formula next Tuesday ahead of Abu Dhabi and the final race of the season. Rob, enjoy Vegas. I'll see you Tuesday.
Thanks, Adam. Hopefully I'm not too hungover for Tuesday. See you then.
Bye, everybody.